an industrial zone in eastern Ukraine. 14:30 hours on a recent winter afternoon. Temperature -3 Celsius. Light wind from northeast at 4 kilometers per hour, not strong enough to disperse heavy gases, but enough to carry them slowly through enclosed spaces. An abandoned chemical facility with massive storage tanks still containing industrial chemicals that had been left unsecured for months. A Russian assault battalion, 1,400 combat soldiers organized into 3 infantry companies and supporting elements, launched coordinated attack to capture industrial zone that represented strategic position controlling rail junction and highway intersection. Ukrainian defenders withdrew systematically under pressure as Russian forces advanced through complex maze of factories, warehouses, and chemical processing facilities. The withdrawal appeared tactical and orderly. By 1500 hours, Russian troops occupied entire facility, including abandoned chemical plant that Ukrainian forces had deliberately surrendered without significant resistance. 6 hours later, 892 soldiers would be dead from chemical exposure to industrial toxins. 355 would be critically poisoned with permanent lung damage, requiring lifetime medical support. 153 would survive uninjured, only because they remained outside or evacuated early. The industrial zone they captured would become toxic death trap, claiming victims for hours after initial occupation, transforming military victory into medical catastrophe. This happened days ago. The zone remains contaminated, requiring extensive cleanup operations. Chemical decontamination continues under strict protocols. Strategic implications of industrial sabotage as weapon are being assessed by military planners worldwide. This is what occurred during those 6 hours that transformed industrial facility into gas chamber. Industrial facilities contain hazardous materials even when abandoned for extended periods. Chemical plants store toxic substances for production processes, chlorine for water treatment and manufacturing, ammonia for fertilizer production and refrigeration, various acids and solvents. These chemicals remain dangerous years after operations cease, maintaining toxicity indefinitely. Military operations near such facilities create significant risks of accidental or deliberate chemical release that can cause mass casualties among unprepared troops. The facility had been chemical production plant operational until conflict began 18 months earlier. Original purpose was manufacturing agricultural chemicals, primarily fertilizers and pesticides, requiring large quantities of industrial feedstocks. When fighting approached the region, plant operators evacuated hastily without implementing proper shutdown procedures or securing hazardous materials. 23 massive storage tanks containing combined total of 340 metric tons of chlorine gas and anhydrous ammonia remained on site. Ukrainian forces controlling area for subsequent months were fully aware of chemical hazards but deliberately left tanks intact. As Russian assault developed over preceding days, Ukrainian command made calculated tactical decision. Rather than defending industrial zone conventionally with infantry positions and artillery support that would result in extended battle with uncertain outcome, they would withdraw deliberately while sabotaging chemical storage. Chlorine and ammonia released in enclosed industrial spaces would create toxic atmosphere lethal to troops without adequate chemical protective equipment, which intelligence indicated Russian forces lacked in sufficient quantities. Ukrainian combat engineers prepared sabotage operation with professional precision before withdrawal commenced. Small teams accessed chemical storage area during final hours of Ukrainian control and systematically opened manual release valves on all 23 storage tanks. The valves were designed for controlled chemical transfer during normal plant operations, but could be locked in fully open position for continuous unrestricted release. Engineers set all valves for maximum flow rate and deliberately disabled emergency shutoff systems, cut electrical power to automatic monitoring, and destroyed valve control mechanisms to prevent easy closure. The sabotage was thorough and professionally executed. 340 metric tons of industrial chemicals began venting into atmosphere at rate of approximately 2 metric tons per minute. Chlorine, appearing as dense greenish-yellow gas significantly heavier than air, settled into low areas, basements, underground utility tunnels, and building interiors. Its density meant it flowed like liquid, pooling in depressions and filling enclosed spaces from bottom upward. Ammonia, being lighter than air with density approximately half that of normal atmosphere, rose and dispersed through upper building levels, attics, and ventilation systems. Both chemicals are highly toxic, causing severe respiratory damage through inhalation even at concentrations as low as 50 parts per million for extended exposure. Russian forces advancing through industrial zone were completely unaware of chemical release occurring as they maneuvered. The chemicals were essentially odorless at extremely low concentrations, below dangerous levels where olfactory detection becomes possible. By the time soldiers detected chlorine's characteristic pungent swimming pool smell or ammonia's sharp, irritating odor, they had already inhaled doses sufficient to cause significant respiratory damage or death. Russian battalion occupied industrial zone at 1500 hours after Ukrainian defenders withdrew to prepared positions 2 kilometers east. Soldiers entered buildings seeking shelter from wind and cold. Officers established command posts and communications centers in enclosed structures offering overhead cover. Infantry companies dispersed through facilities securing defensive positions in anticipation of possible Ukrainian counterattack. Nobody among Russian forces recognized that buildings were systematically filling with toxic gas concentrations, reaching immediately dangerous to life and health levels. Initial symptoms appeared within 10 to 15 minutes of exposure commencement. Soldiers began experiencing throat irritation, described as burning sensation, persistent coughing without apparent cause, difficulty breathing or shortness of breath during minimal exertion. These symptoms were initially attributed to dust stirred up during assault, smoke from vehicles, or general physical exhaustion from combat operations. As symptoms intensified rapidly, severe chest pain, extreme breathing difficulty, bloody coughing producing pink frothy sputum, battalion medical personnel were urgently summoned to treat growing numbers of casualties presenting with similar symptom patterns. Battalion medical staff attempted to treat growing flood of casualties using standard field medical protocols. Soldiers presenting with acute respiratory distress were given supplemental oxygen through masks and evacuated to battalion aid stations for assessment and treatment. As casualty numbers grew exponentially, 10 soldiers, then 50, then 200, medical personnel recognized this wasn't normal battlefield injury pattern from conventional weapons. Chemical exposure was strongly suspected, but specific agent and source weren't immediately identified because industrial chemicals weren't considered likely threat. Russian soldiers had severely limited chemical protection equipment available for this operation. Standard issue theoretically includes GP5 or GP7 gas masks for each soldier, but only approximately 20% of battalion actually carried masks due to supply shortages and decisions to prioritize ammunition and other equipment. Even soldiers with masks often stored them in backpacks or vehicles, rather than wearing them in immediately accessible ready position. By the time chemical exposure was definitively recognized and gas mask order issued, many soldiers had already inhaled lethal doses of chlorine or ammonia that would kill them within hours, regardless of subsequent treatment. Chlorine exposure causes immediate severe respiratory tract damage through chemical burns. At high concentrations above 1,000 parts per million, chlorine gas burns delicate lung tissue, causing rapid fluid accumulation in alveoli, tiny air sacs where gas exchange occurs. Victims essentially drown in fluids generated by their own damaged lungs through a condition called pulmonary edema. Death occurs within 2 to 6 hours from progressive respiratory failure as lungs lose capacity for oxygen transfer. Lower exposures between 50 and 300 parts per million cause permanent lung scarring and significantly reduced breathing capacity, requiring lifetime supplemental oxygen. Ammonia exposure creates similar devastating effects through different mechanism. Ammonia gas readily dissolves in moisture present in respiratory tract, creating caustic ammonium hydroxide solution that chemically burns mucous membranes, throat, bronchi, and lung tissue. High exposures above 300 parts per million cause immediate severe breathing difficulties, laryngeal spasm that blocks airway, and rapid onset pulmonary edema. Lower exposures lead to chronic lung problems, including bronchitis, asthma, and progressive fibrosis that reduces lung function permanently. Russian casualties mounted with terrifying rapidity. By 1600 hours, just 1 hour after occupation, 300 soldiers were completely incapacitated by by severe respiratory distress, requiring immediate evacuation and intensive medical intervention. Field hospitals attached to Battalion weren't equipped to treat chemical exposure casualties. Required specialized treatments, including aggressive oxygen therapy, bronchodilators, corticosteroids, and mechanical ventilation, weren't available at battalion level. Soldiers were evacuated to rear area hospitals, but many died during transport lasting 1 to 2 hours, or died shortly after reaching medical facilities that also lacked adequate capability to treat mass chemical casualties. Battalion commander, himself beginning to experience respiratory symptoms from command post exposure, ordered complete evacuation of industrial zone at 16:30 hours. All personnel were directed to withdraw immediately to open areas at least 1 kilometer upwind of chemical release to avoid further exposure. This order unquestionably saved hundreds of lives, but came too late for soldiers who had already been exposed to fatal doses during 90 minutes of occupation. Evacuation was extremely chaotic and disorganized. Soldiers experienced severe difficulty breathing, making physical exertion nearly impossible, disorientation and confusion from hypoxia as oxygen levels in blood dropped, and panic from recognizing chemical threat and seeing comrades collapsing. Some soldiers collapsed unconscious while attempting to exit contaminated areas. Others became hopelessly lost in industrial complex maze while experiencing impaired cognitive function. Many soldiers needed physical assistance from comrades to reach safety, slowing evacuation. Soldiers evacuating from contaminated zone carried toxic chemicals on contaminated clothing and equipment. Secondary exposures occurred when unexposed soldiers assisted contaminated victims without protective equipment. Medical personnel treating casualties without proper chemical protective gear became casualties themselves when exposed to off-gassing from victims' clothing. The contamination spread through physical contact and proximity, creating additional casualties among would-be rescuers. By 1700 hours, Battalion had completely withdrawn from industrial zone. Behind them, in contaminated buildings, remained bodies of soldiers who had collapsed from acute chemical exposure and died before evacuation could reach them. Equipment was abandoned where it stood, too contaminated for safe recovery. The facility was declared total loss, too contaminated for occupation or recovery operations without extensive decontamination requiring specialized equipment. Casualty assessment revealed absolute catastrophe that shocked Russian command. 1,247 soldiers were exposed to toxic chemicals from battalion nominal strength of 1,400. 892 soldiers died within first 6 hours from acute respiratory failure as their chemically burned lungs lost capacity to transfer oxygen. 355 soldiers survived initial exposure but suffered severe permanent lung damage, requiring lifetime medical care and supplemental oxygen. Only 153 soldiers avoided significant exposure, mostly vehicle crews who remained in enclosed armored vehicles with NBC filtration systems or perimeter guards positioned outside contaminated zone. Deaths continued accumulating over following days and weeks. Soldiers with extremely high chemical exposure but delayed death experienced progressive respiratory deterioration as damaged lung tissue continued degrading from chemical burns. Lungs swelled, filled with fluid, and eventually failed completely. Many developed secondary bacterial infections in damaged respiratory tissue that led to lethal pneumonia. Additional 112 soldiers died over following 2 weeks, bringing cumulative death toll to 1,004, representing 71% mortality rate for the battalion. Survivors with permanent lung damage faced catastrophic permanent disability, ending military careers and severely impacting civilian life. Chemically scarred lung tissue cannot regenerate. Damage is permanent and irreversible. Reduced breathing capacity affects all physical activities, from simple walking to basic self-care tasks. Many survivors required supplemental oxygen continuously. None would ever return to military service or perform physically demanding work. The 355 survivors represented permanent medical burden requiring expensive lifelong treatment, estimated at tens of millions of dollars. Russian command faced immediate intense international scrutiny over massive chemical casualties. Initial official reports claimed Ukrainian forces had used prohibited military chemical weapons in violation of Chemical Weapons Convention and Geneva Protocol. International investigation revealed actual truth. Ukrainian forces had released pre-existing industrial chemicals stored at facility, not deployed military chemical agents like nerve gas or blister agents. This legal distinction was enormously significant under international law, but tactically irrelevant to casualties who died identically regardless of chemical classification. The incident highlighted critical vulnerability of military operations near industrial facilities containing hazardous materials. Many industrial sites across conflict zones contain dangerous chemicals in significant quantities. Conventional military doctrine developed for traditional battlefield operations doesn't adequately address these industrial chemical hazards. Troops advancing through industrial areas require comprehensive chemical protective equipment, continuous atmospheric monitoring using detection devices, and specialized training in chemical hazard recognition. Ukrainian tactical doctrine demonstrated sophisticated understanding of modern industrial warfare principles. By releasing existing industrial chemicals rather than deploying prohibited military chemical weapons, they achieved devastating tactical effects while remaining within international legal frameworks. Industrial sabotage releasing pre-existing chemicals isn't explicitly prohibited by Chemical Weapons Convention governing military chemical agents. This legal nuance provided political cover while achieving military objective. The numbers define comprehensive disaster: 1,004 soldiers dead, 355 permanently disabled, 1 battalion effectively destroyed by industrial chemicals, 6 hours from occupation to recognition of chemical threat, 340 metric tons of chlorine and ammonia released, 71% fatality rate. Total military value of captured objective, 0. Cost of victory, annihilation. This is modern warfare where industrial infrastructure becomes weapon delivery system, where existing chemicals prove more lethal than conventional artillery fires, where 6 hours in contaminated facility destroys entire battalion more effectively than weeks of combat. The industrial zone remains cordoned off by hazmat teams. Chemical contamination persists in enclosed spaces, requiring professional decontamination. Bodies of soldiers who died from exposure in initial hours have been recovered and identified. Equipment remains abandoned throughout facility, too heavily contaminated for recovery without extensive decontamination protocols. Welcome to warfare where factories are sophisticated traps, where industrial chemicals kill as effectively as purpose-designed military weapons, where 6 hours transforms captured objective into toxic graveyard, claiming more casualties than conventional combat.